Mm. So let me just put this in. Spotlight for everyone. And okay, good. Okay, so this evening, what I wanted to do, so last two times actually, we've been talking about primarily the teaching aspect of the true uh, true teaching practice attainment of the Pure Land Way, or the Kyogyo Shinsho. Um, and I briefly introduced the larger sutra, and particularly what we call the main vows of that. And so this time, what I wanted to do was go into the second chapter of this true teaching practice attainment of the Pure Land Way, is a chapter on practice, and more specifically on the Pure Land practice. So I wanted to focus tonight, this evening, on this idea of practice. What is practice to begin with? So where I want to start off is by talking about practice in early Buddhism, as well as um, practice for, I guess, as Buddhism develops, and the role of practice in Jodo Shinshu. Oh, hang on. Three more people joining in, so we'll just let them join in. Good evening, everyone, and thank you to those who just joined in. Welcome, and Happy New Year again for those I have not seen yet this year. Oh, can you all hear me okay, first of all? Yes, it's coming in okay, good. So as I mentioned last week, or the last two times, actually there's been a couple of cancellations. I apologize for cancellations in December, but I hope we'll be able to catch up. Well, there's no really catch up. We're not on a timeline per se, but what I'd like to do tonight. So last time we talked about the chapter on teaching, or last two times we talked about chapter on teaching in the Kyogyo Shinsho, or the true teaching practice and attainment of the Pure Land Way. And we focused on the larger Sutra of Amida, and in particular the what we call the primary vows, or the most important vows in the 48 vows of Amida Buddha. And so this time, what I wanted to do was talk a little bit more about practice, going away from teachings, although the teaching will come back in again. But focus on the second chapter in the Kyogyo Shinsho is the chapter on practice, more specifically Pure Land practice. And so what I thought we would do is review, first of all, practice in general in Buddhism, and how it developed along the way, and how that has then led to what we call the Pure Land practices. And when we finish this, hopefully tonight, then we'll be at the beginning of actually going into the Shoshinge, which was originally the aim of this lecture, was to talk on the Shoshinge, which is a song that was written by Shinai Shonin, a verse that was written by Shinai Shonin, which is in this Kyogyo Shinsho, the true teaching practice and attainment of the Pure Land Way. And so all that we've been doing last fall has been an introduction into getting into Shoshinge. So very, 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 very long introduction. And tonight's is also partially the introduction as well. So when we talk about the role of practice in Buddhism, we have to start off with how practice was understood in fundamental Buddhism and later in the Theravada school. So basically, you would have the teaching, and then the goal of the teaching was to alleviate one from suffering or attaining the same goal that the Buddha attained, historical Buddha attained, which was enlightenment or nirvana. And so in order to get to that goal, you have to follow practice. There's often an analogy that's used of a mountain. And it's so basically what it is that when you look at the Buddhist teachings, you start off at the base of the mountain and you realize how distant you are from the peak of the mountain, which is the goal of enlightenment. And in order to get to that peak, you have to follow various paths, or you have your choice, obviously. But once you choose the path, you have to go up that mountain. And that is the practice, if you will. And the very clear-cut example of that is the Four Noble Truths. And we've discussed Four Noble Truths in previous lectures before. But the first two, the truth of suffering and the truth of causation of suffering, basically, it shows us our human existence. So this is when we come to the realization that maybe life was not as rosy as I had previously thought. And I think for us in our society right now, in the last several years, the pandemic has really forced us to see our own frailty as society, as humanity. And we begin to realize that we are not invincible, and that there is suffering that exists within our lives. The longer we live, the longer or the more one begins to see suffering in their lives. Right now, I'm looking after a 103-year-old gentleman, and he often says that there's nothing good about living too long. He says there's nothing but suffering, and I think as you get older, some of you probably can relate to that statement. But that understanding of suffering is the first step into leading out of it. It is, in the analogy of the mountain, it is when the traveler first looks up to realize that they're at the foot of a mountain. Until then, they may have been looking down and not realizing that they've been walking aimlessly in the forest. But the moment that they look up and realize there's a mountain towering over them, that's the realization, the truth of suffering or the causation of suffering. Both of these together makes us realize our present situation. So then from there, in the Four Noble Truths, of course, the Buddha talked about the third one was the cessation of suffering. That is the ultimate peak. And in order to get there, the fourth Noble Truth is a path to the cessation of suffering. And that's what we call the Noble Eightfold Path. And the actual traversing up the mountain is the actual practicing or following these practices. Now, in the fundamental Buddhism and early Buddhism, in order to follow this Noble Eightfold Path, it was believed that one had to really enter a monastery and lead a monastic lifestyle. So that was what was stressed in the fundamental Buddhism, which later became the Theravada Buddhism. And so according to the Theravada Buddhism, this way of traversing through the practices, through the path, we slowly get rid of our sufferings and attain the same enlightenment as the historical. Well, actually, no, I should rephrase that. According to the Theravada or the fundamental Buddhists, we don't exactly attain the exact same enlightenment. There's still a little bit of a difference. They reserve the enlightenment of Shakyamuni Buddha on a very high pedestal. So out of respect, we attain enlightenment, but not quite the same as the historical Buddha. So then, because this school of Buddhism or branch of Buddhism was really focused on the monastic lifestyle, as Buddhism developed, we see the development of what we call the Mahayana Buddhism. And with the Mahayana Buddhism, there's two major developments that occur. One is that it is a movement of lay Buddhism. And this actually comes along with what we call the transference of merit. And what this is that through the teachings, it was said that the merit can be transferred from individual to individual. A good example of this is that it's said that if one person enters or becomes a monk or a nun, it will benefit that family for 7 generations. Okay, so you've done a good deed that will benefit your family 7 generations. So I'm pretty lucky because now I've benefited 7 generations. I don't have to worry. I'm benefiting 7 generations. No, actually, but this whole idea of transference of merit became very important because of what it meant was that the lay people can receive merit that's transferred through those who are doing the monastic undertaking. Also, along with this was the development of what we call the Bodhisattva path, which follows what we call the 6 paramitas. And I've listed the 6 paramitas here. These are what we call Bodhisattva practices. Now, the Bodhisattva is an individual who aspires for enlightenment. Sattva, Bodhi is enlightenment, and Sattva is one who aspires. So Bodhisattva is one who aspires for enlightenment. But what's interesting about the Bodhisattvas is that as they begin to practice their Bodhisattva path, they begin to realize that their practice is not just for themselves, but in fact, their practice ultimately becomes benefiting others. So although you start off with the aspiration or enlightenment, as what you practice, that aspiration develops and expands, where it becomes not just as aspiration for your own enlightenment, but it becomes aspiration for the enlightenment of all beings. So this is a very important concept. And when we look at this 6 paramitas, the first one is, as you can see, dana paramita, selfless giving. Okay, so generosity or giving of self. So just by that alone, you can see that the practice of giving to others is being developed. Okay, and then the next one, sila paramita, discipline, morality, proper conduct. In Japanese, jikai haramitsu. The first one in Japanese is fuse haramitsu. And then the next one, santi paramita, is patience, tolerance, endurance, ninniku haramitsu. And then vira paramita, effort of diligence, shojin haramitsu. And then dhyana paramita, contemplation or concentration, Zenjo Haramitsu. And then finally, what we call Prajna Paramita, wisdom or insight. So, or Hanya Haramitsu in Japanese. These six, so originally, when the Mahayana school first started, which is about 1000 AD is when it started developing. This notion of following these practices, basically it started off where an individual, through these practices, is purifying themselves, ridding themselves slowly of their what they call human defilements or human passions by following this practice. But as I mentioned earlier, when they start practicing this, they begin to realize simultaneously as they are practicing that their aspirations are the aspiration for all beings. So another way of defining bodhisattva is one who is on the path to enlightenment, but they forego their own enlightenment until all beings are able to attain enlightenment together. So this comes about because as they're practicing selfless giving, giving to others, there's awakening or awareness that comes about that there is actually no other. So this prajna paramita, or wisdom, or what we call non-discriminatory wisdom. Non-discriminatory wisdom is developed. And non-discriminatory wisdom is the wisdom that transcends self and others. So as the practice develops, you begin to realize that what you're doing is at the same time for the well-being of all beings. So there isn't a distinction anymore about I'm doing this for me or I'm doing this for other, but it transcends both of that. Okay, so it's a little complicated, but why this is important is because in that, as I mentioned, the first development of lay Buddhism is that this is where the transference of merit comes about. As the bodhisattvas practice, they're transferring their merit to the lay or to all sentient beings. So now what happens is up until then, Buddhism was very much an individualistic thing where you practice for your own enlightenment, right? You try to perfect your practice. This is the fundamental Theravada school, is that you practice for your own enlightenment. It's like that, climbing up that mountain. You're climbing up the mountain for yourself. But as this ideal of the bodhisattva path takes place, then you begin to see the development of working for others. And the pinnacle of this thought process or development is the Pure Land teachings of Amida Buddha. And talking about how Amida Buddha became Amida Buddha from first being what we call the Bodhisattva, Dhammakara Bodhisattva, Hozo Bosatsu in Japanese. So you can see how that whole idea of Amida comes about as there's an emphasis on this Bodhisattva path with the ultimate example of that being the story of Amida Buddha. So when we look at that, according to the Pure Land teachings, let me just change one to this one. Okay, so as we, Oh yeah. Okay. So then Mahayana movement. Yeah. Okay. And then so in the Pure Land teaching then, what is the fundamental practice? And the fundamental practice, according to the Pure Land teaching, is the what we call Namo Amida Butsu, or the name of the Buddha. And this was actually there's a history of Pure Land Buddhism, and we'll get into this when we get into Shoshinge as well. What we call the 7 patriarchs. And on the very first lecture, I gave you that handout with the 7 patriarchs on it. Let me see if maybe I can bring that up. Let me just find that. Okay. Oh, sorry. There you go. Okay, this diagram, do you remember seeing this diagram, right? So it was the 5th of these 7 patriarchs, or Shantou Zendo Daishi, okay, who lived in China between 613 and 681. It was Shantou Zendo Daishi, in his commentary on the Contemplation Sutra. He was the one that stated that, in fact, there are what we call right acts or practices versus miscellaneous acts. And these 5 right acts, he said, were chanting sutras. So single-mindedly chanting such sutras as the 3 Pure Land Sutras, contemplation, concentrating on Amida and his land of bliss, worshiping, single-mindedly worshiping Amida Buddha, recitation, single-mindedly reciting the name of Amida Buddha, and praising and making offerings, single-mindedly praising and making offerings to Amida Buddha. And of these 5 right acts, he said the recitation, the single-mindedly reciting the name of Amida Buddha is the most important and is known as the act of right assurance. And the remaining 4 are what we call auxiliary acts. They assist in the recitation of the name of the Buddha. So it was Zendo who actually stated that when we say Nembutsu, Nembutsu is the recitation of the name of the Buddha. Why this is important is that prior to Zendo, and even after, there are many who, when you see the characters for Nembutsu, it can actually mean thinking of the Buddha. Okay, thinking of the Buddha. Nenzuru, right? The character for Nen and Nembutsu, it literally, if you split it into its 2 halves, it literally says the Buddha in right now heart. So that character, right now heart, means the Buddha, and then Butsu is Buddha. So right now heart Buddha, which means having the Buddha in my heart at this instant. So the more traditional understanding of that is the thought of Amida Buddha. So Nembutsu was not necessarily reciting the name out loud, but just thinking of the Buddha was Nembutsu. But it was a Zendo Daishi or Shantou who clarified that it is in fact a recitation, reciting the name, vocalizing it, is what is known as the right act. And again, Honen Shonin, who was following Zendo, or two after Zendo. Honen was Shinran Shonin's teacher. He also followed Zendo's teaching and said, again, that the Nembutsu, the reciting of the name, is the right act. Now, what's important here is for both of these and for all the Pure Land masters, this practice, A, was the right practice because it was the one that was selected by Amida Buddha to be the practice. So if we go back to last week, and I'm just going to pull up one more thing here. Okay, and this is kind of small. Where is that? So we looked at what we call the true vows last week, and in particular, this 17th vow, if when I attain Buddhahood, innumerable Buddhas in the land of the 10 directions should not all praise and glorify my name, then may I not attain perfect enlightenment. And in the 18th vow, it says specifically, if when I attain Buddhahood, sentient beings in the lands of the 10 directions who sincerely and joyfully entrust themselves to me, desire to be born in my land, and call my name even 10 times, should not be born there, then may I not attain perfect enlightenment. So call my name even 10 times is spelled out right there in the 18th vow. So according to Zendo, Shantao, and according to Honen, and to all the Pure Land masters before, this was the right practice. But it was definitely the practice of the follower or listener. Okay, so it was something that we have to do. We have to listen to the calling voice of the Buddha, and then we answer that calling voice by reciting the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, and that is our practice. Now, that was a traditional understanding within the Pure Land school. But Shinran Shonin actually sort of put everything upside down. And what I mean by that, I'll explain in a second. So when I want to just go back to the development of this Mahayana school, the development of the Bodhisattva path. Okay, so as I mentioned, that with the Bodhisattva path, as one follows the path, simultaneously, they begin the practice begins to be more altruistic for others, right? As I mentioned, you begin to develop, or it becomes the practice for others, or there's no separation between practice for the self and practice for benefiting all beings. And when this develops, the bodhisattvas, when they become a Buddha or in that same state, they attain what we call prajna paramita, or the non-discriminatory wisdom, right? And the prajna paramita, it becomes very important to the Mahayana school. And there are a whole series of sutras, prajna paramita sutras, probably one of the most famous of those being the Heart Sutra. And I know where's Suizone. Suizone is probably nodding his head right now to this because he loves the Heart Sutra. And the Heart Sutra is one of the most famous Mahayana sutras, A, because it's relatively short, and B, because of its insight and depth. And the Heart Sutra begins with this line that says, when Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva was practicing deep prajnaparamita, they saw that the 5 aggregates are all empty. Here then, form is no other than emptiness. Emptiness no other than form. Form is only emptiness. Emptiness only form. This is a very famous phrase from the Heart Sutra, saying when we talk about emptiness, it doesn't mean zero or nothing. But what it means is that there is nothing that exists without the complete interconnectedness with all beings. And therefore, there is no such thing as the self. When we examine, he begins by talking about the 5 aggregates. 5 aggregates are the things that make our beings up, the 5 elements that bring that we are made up of. And when you start examining that, you realize there is no one entity that you could point to. Everything is made up because of causes and conditions. And so there is an emptiness, yet at the same time, when we talk about non-discriminatory wisdom, it goes beyond, it includes form. So it has to transcend that idea of form and no form. And so when we talk about the vows of Amida Buddha, Shinran Shonin looked at it a little differently from the traditional Pure Land masters. And where Shinran Shonin understood it from was from that mindset of non-discriminatory wisdom, or in this case, known as infinite wisdom. And why this is important is because of this. So normally when we practice, we set our goals, just like the early Buddhists, right? You set your goals and you set out a practice and you try to do it for your own benefit, right? So New Year's is a good time for this because we often set New Year's resolution. And one of the resolutions I often set, and it seems to be, I make this often year after year, is I will try to be more mindful of what I eat so that I can lose a little bit of weight, maybe, right? And when I make that resolution, you see, if somebody else goes on a diet, it doesn't benefit me, right? I have to go on that diet. Somebody else could lose weight, it doesn't benefit me. But when you look at the vows of Amida Buddha, if we go back to these vows, right? The 17th vow, look at what the Buddha says. He says, if when I attain Buddhahood, innumerable Buddhas in the lands of the 10 directions should not all praise and glorify my name, then may I not attain perfect enlightenment. So it's based on the actions of others, right? It's saying that those Buddhas in the 10 directions, of the lands of the 10 directions, they are all going to praise my name. They are going to be and unless that happens, I will not attain enlightenment. So this practice is a little odd when you think about it. It's not doing it for, or he's the Buddha, Amida Buddha is not completing the action. It's completed by others, okay? But if you look at it from this perspective of non-discriminatory wisdom, where others and myself are one, okay, then it starts to make sense because the actions of those Buddhas in the 10 directions, their actions are also predicated on the fact that they have realized the vows of Amida Buddha are that great that they praise the name of the Buddha. So it's from that perspective, the Buddha's vow, Amida Buddha's vow, is completed by the other Buddhas because they are actually, the actions of the other Buddhas are one with Amida Buddha, the thoughts of Amida Buddha, the vows of Amida Buddha. So this then becomes a different understanding from the other masters, okay? And so when we get to the 18th vow as well is determined by the actions of others, you see? Because it says, if when I attain Buddhahood, sentient beings in the lands of the 10 direction who sincerely and joyfully entrust themselves to me, desire to be born in my land and call my name even 10 times, should not be born there, then may I not attain enlightenment. Here again, you see, the Buddha is saying, if the sentient beings in the 10 quarters do not call out my name perhaps 10 times, then I will not attain enlightenment. Again, this calling out by sentient beings is the practice of Amida Buddha. It is the wish of Amida Buddha. And it is one and the same thing. So from this non-discriminatory wisdom perspective, when the sentient beings complete that act, the practice of the Buddha is also completed. And therefore, the recitation of Namo Amida Butsu, it is I who am reciting, but it is also the practice of the completing the practice of the Buddha. So therefore, it's not just me that's doing it, but it is through, because we receive this infinite compassion that we recite the name Namo Amida Butsu. So this then is where Shinran Shonin differs greatly from all the other masters, is because he doesn't see it as my act to do, an act that was selected by the Buddha, but it is still my actions for my benefit. Shinran looks at the recitation of the name is in fact a completion of the practice of Amida Buddha, is completing that wish, if you will, of the Buddha. So it is the one and the same. It's yes, my recitation, but it is through that recitation that we're fulfilling the vow of Amida Buddha. So it becomes actually the practice of Amida Buddha through this understanding of non-discriminatory wisdom. And so for Shinran, then this, what we call the entrusting, joyfully entrusting heart becomes fundamental to Shinran's understanding of the Pure Land Buddhism or Amida Buddha's teaching. And therefore, in his true teaching, practice, and attainment of the Pure Land Way, in the Kyogyo Shinsho, Shinran reserves one whole chapter just on this entrusting heart, or Shinji. And the role of the Shoshinge, the hymn on the true Shinjin and Nembutsu, is the connection, the connector. It comes at the end of the chapter on practice, and it leads into the chapter on Shinjin, or true faith. And so this, and within that very relatively short chant, it encapsulates all of the teachings of Jodo Shinshu. It summarizes the teachings of Jodo Shinshu. So from next week, what I'd like to do is actually get into that Shoshin Geppo. So I wanted to leave it off there for tonight. Does anybody have questions, comments? Please feel free to chime in. There might have been quite a bit for you to take in.
I have a question, Grant.
Yes, please.
So the concept of well, bodhisattva, I guess I for a long time I felt I could define what the bodhisattva was or represented, but I realized sort of tonight that encapsulates the concept of other power. But my question really is that concept all Mahayana Buddhism or Pure Land?
No, so we use the terminology other power, but the concept of the bodhisattva as one who is practicing to benefit all, that is very fundamental Mahayana Buddhism. And therefore, we look at Amida Buddha as being of course, this is from the Pure Land school perspective, but the Amida Buddha is the pinnacle of bodhisattva practice, if you will. Right?
Yes.
Are there any other comments or questions, please? Yes, Rose. If you could unmute yourself.
Sorry, it's right there. Yeah. Up the top there. Yeah. Yeah. So even being but being together tonight, listening and to that wisdom and listening together for me is in the same way the Nembutsu. It's being part of that because we're together in this, so we're connecting it out, and then that will move from us to the other people and other sentient beings that are in our in the sphere, in that circle, that connection that just goes out. Does that feel that that's another way also, that everything we do is everything?
Yeah. So I guess there needs to be some clarification.
Mhm.
So from the perspective of the Dharma or non-discriminatory wisdom, you're correct. Everything that we do is interconnected and we are connected. However, from the perspective of an ignorant being, we are not often connected. We do. If you look on my screen, it's a gallery screen, and I can see little boxes with each individuals, and that's exactly how we view all those around us. We put them in little box. We categorize them, put them in little boxes, and we might have boxes that say, "I like this person," and so that goes in the like boxes, and then there's other boxes that say, "I don't like this person," and they go in the dislike. So we, unfortunately, we have the discriminatory way of thinking, whereas from the Buddha's perspective, it transcends that. But yes, you're right. From that perspective, everything is interconnected, and all that we do, we share in this. And perhaps by listening together, maybe a little bit, we're breaking the barriers down of me versus you and them, or that categorization. So so listening together helps us, I guess, to get maybe a little closer to understanding. I don't know. That answer sounds very convoluted and confusing to me.
I am getting really essence of Shinran's Pure Land Shodo Shinshu. But question is, if you are so selflessness, how can you you are not influencing other 10, say, let's say 10 people around your own enlightenment, at your own enlightenment, still you're not really enlightened, or how to say, you haven't achieved your goal. How do you proceed from there? Or how does he say, what does it mean by all others are enlightened, otherwise?
Yeah, so I think there, and we could get into this more in the weeks to come, but one of the things that Shinan, one has to realize Shinan Shonin went through a process himself, and he spent 20 years on Mount Hiei as a Tendai monk.
Mhm.
And in his practices, what he was doing was trying to purify himself through the practices, slowly ridding himself of his defilements.
Mhm.
But as he did this, the more he did this, well, one of my teachers said, it's like peeling the peels of an onion to find the core of the onion.
Mhm.
Well, if you've ever peeled the peels of the onion, you can peel away and you'll never get to a core because it's all peels, right? So it's like this. So Shinan himself came to that limitation of his own awareness or awakening. And because of that, he encountered this entrusting heart or the working of Amida Buddha.
Mhm.
When he realized his income, what's the word I'm thinking of?
No, incomprehensible.
Incapability of attaining this enlightenment through his own efforts. He was actually at a very, very difficult, or he was suffering a great deal. And this is when he encountered or understood this idea of the non-discriminatory wisdom of Amida Buddha, that even with his faults, as he was, the practice of reciting the name is fulfilling the practice of Amida Buddha. And so he had complete entrusting in the Buddha's words. So we'll get into this more, but that's a very important question of how do you know, or how even if you try hard, not fulfilling that goal of attaining enlightenment. So yeah, we will discuss this further in the coming weeks. So thank you, Jun-san, for that
Thank you.
question. Anybody else? Tomoko-san or Linda, did you have any questions or comments? Or
I have a similar question. So, trying to practice for your own enlightenment. You said that at the same time, all other sentient beings would feel purified. So how do you do that?
okay, so first of all, you have to differentiate between the ignorant being as myself versus a bodhisattva. So I am not a bodhisattva yet. Bodhisattva is a much higher, if you will, along the path to enlightenment. So it's when the bodhisattvas do their practice, or And the focus on the bodhisattva practices, it starts off with this the selfless giving, or muga in Japanese.
Mhm.
And so just by that alone, you begin to realize your practice is for the benefit, to helping others. You start off with that practice, helping others. And so then you begin to realize, or as they develop their practice, they begin to realize that in fact, their practice is not only for themselves, but their practice is for all sentient beings. So their goal of attaining enlightenment is also not just for yourself, but it is to simultaneously achieve enlightenment for all beings. So it's the elements of wisdom and compassion in Buddhism. In this idea of compassion, of thinking of others or benefiting others, becomes very important. So compassion and wisdom, as I've mentioned many times before, go hand in hand. And as you practice, you develop, or you realize that your practice is not for yourself; it is for the others. I don't know how else to put that. We could think about it and talk about it again next week too.
Thank you.
There are no question.
How about anybody else? Yvonne? Linda, any comments, questions? No?
And
Yes, Linda.
hi, hello, Sensei. I was just a little confused about the 6 paramitas in relation to Jodo Shinshu, because that's more about not the first 3, but I think it's the last 3, particularly the meditation and wisdom samadhis. They're part of a meditation process where different stages you go through to get to
Right.
the point where you're almost, when you hit wisdom samadhi, you're almost like an arhat, or you're pretty close to being an arhat. And we don't, like Jodo Shinshu doesn't do meditation. You're not sitting on a cushion meditating. So I'm not really sure how that, did you just mention that as part of Mahayana, or is there a connection between like those last 3 of the 6 paramitas?
Yeah, so I guess the connection there would be the fact that, in fact, for Shina, and this is where the interesting heart comes in, especially the last, the Prajna Paramita, is Shina basically understands it to be when we talk about Amida Buddha, he spent 5 kalpas meditating to complete his vows. So the wisdom that Amida gained through his practices is the ultimate this non-discriminatory wisdom. It is the oneness of the ignorant and the infinite. And so for Shinan, that's how he was able to understand that the practice of reciting the name was not my practice, but it was actually completing the practice of Amida Buddha. So when we recite the name, we are reciting at the same time. And again, this is that whole notion of form and is not form, and it's quite a unique understanding of Pure Land Buddhism, because up until then, as I mentioned, the practice was still seen to be something that I do for benefiting, or so that I can go to the Pure Land, as opposed to my recitation is actually fulfilling the practice of the Buddha. And so I am part of that, of the Buddha's practice, which is at the same time my practice as well. So, but the wisdom is definitely, Shinran says, is not him, but it is the Amida Buddha. The fulfillment of the wisdom is and therefore the entrusting mind for Shinran becomes paramount. Basically, in Japanese we say omakase, and omakase means to leave it up to the Buddha, to accept that the vows of Amida Buddha as they are, and not say to view it as I am doing that, or it is my practice, or take ownership of that.
So because Amida Buddha has already done this, we don't have to do this part then. It's not something we have to do. It's like it's rolled into the recitation of the name then. Is that close to? Am I on the right track or not? It's like, I'm not sure. Like,
Well, so again, with the 6 paramitas, they are ideals that will be very difficult for Bombu, defiled beings with filled with defilements to wholly follow or complete. And I don't want to, I can't say you shouldn't do it, but Shinran came to realization he couldn't complete it himself on his own, and that there was something that was much greater. Like there's no comparison in the Prajna Paramita of Amida Buddha, the non-discriminatory wisdom of Amida Buddha, and anything that I could ever imagine to attain on my own. Like we're talking, complete utter difference in concept or yeah. Let's talk about this next some more, or think about it some more.
Okay.
Yeah.
okay, thank you. Sensei.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Okay, so if there are no other questions or comments, I mean, if you think of anything during the week, please feel free to either email me or bring it up next week. But thank you all for joining us, and I'll see you next week then. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sensei.
Very much.